Motivation is the invisible current that powers every human action. In psychological terms, it's the biopsychological drive that initiates, directs, and sustains behavior. It's not just a feeling or a burst of enthusiasm, it's a coordinated system involving the brain, body, and environment. At its core, motivation decides why we do something, how we do it, and how long we keep doing it. Biologically, motivation is tightly connected to the brain's reward system, especially the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. Dopamine, often called the motivation molecule, doesn't just make us feel good when we achieve something, it fires in anticipation of reward. This means the brain releases dopamine when it predicts something valuable might happen, nudging us to move toward it. Neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz's 1997 research made this clear. Dopamine spikes not at the moment of success, but at the possibility of success. The idea that motivation arises from biological needs goes back decades. Psychologist Clark Hull in 1943 proposed the drive reduction theory, suggesting that behavior is driven by internal tensions like hunger or thirst that we act to reduce. When we satisfy those needs, the tension eases and the drive fades until it builds again. Although later theories expanded beyond this biological model, Hull's work laid the foundation for understanding motivation as a system designed to maintain balance, or homeostasis, in both body and mind. Later, psychologists Edward Desai and Richard Ryan broadened the concept with their self-determination theory, 1985. They distinguished between intrinsic motivation, doing something for internal satisfaction, and extrinsic motivation, doing it for external rewards like money or praise. According to their research, intrinsic motivation tends to produce deeper learning and longer-lasting engagement, while extrinsic rewards can be effective but often temporary. From a neuroscientific perspective, motivation can also be seen as mental energy allocation. Our brains constantly calculate where to direct attention and effort, much like budgeting energy toward goals that seem most rewarding or achievable. This process explains why motivation fluctuates. It's not just about willpower, but about how the brain manages limited cognitive and emotional resources. In essence, motivation is not a single emotion or impulse. It's a dynamic process shaped by biology, psychology, and experience. It drives us to act, helps us persist, and determines what feels worth striving for. At the biological level, motivation begins with chemistry, specifically the activity of dopamine, the neurotransmitter most associated with desire and drive. It's important to understand that dopamine doesn't make us like something, it makes us want it. In 1998, Kent Berridge and Terry Robinson drew a crucial distinction between wanting and liking. Liking is the pleasure we get from an experience, but wanting is the anticipation that pushes us to seek it out. This means we can crave goals long before we actually enjoy achieving them. The brain continuously measures and updates this wanting system through what neuroscientists call reward prediction error. Each time we act toward a goal, the brain compares what actually happens to what it expected. If the result is better than expected, dopamine surges. If it's worse, dopamine levels dip. Over time, this process fine-tunes our motivation, teaching us which actions are worth repeating and which are not. This constant calibration explains why success can reinforce habits, and why repeated disappointment erodes effort. Hormones also play a major role in shaping motivation. Cortisol, released during stress, can temporarily heighten focus and alertness, but chronic stress floods the system and leads to burnout, making effort feel exhausting. Serotonin, linked to mood stability, influences long-term motivation by helping us feel content and balanced. Even energy availability, like glucose levels or sleep quality, directly impacts how much mental fuel we have to stay engaged with a task. Several key brain regions coordinate these signals. The nucleus accumbens evaluates rewards and energizes pursuit behavior. The prefrontal cortex acts as the planner, deciding when and how to act, maintaining discipline and overriding impulses. The amygdala ties emotion to motivation, amplifying drive when something feels urgent or meaningful. Together, these regions form a network that determines not only what we want, but also how strongly we pursue it. But there's a built-in catch: the brain adapts. This process, known as hedonic adaptation, means that over time our neural response to repeated rewards diminishes. What once felt thrilling gradually becomes normal. This hedonic treadmill ensures survival by keeping us striving, but it also explains why even after achieving major goals, people often feel an unexpected sense of emptiness. Novelty fades, dopamine levels settle, and the brain begins searching for the next challenge. So the biology of motivation isn't just about feeling inspired. It's a living feedback system, balancing chemical signals, brain regions, and bodily states to keep us moving toward what matters most in the moment. When we shift from biology to psychology, motivation becomes a story about meaning, about why certain goals ignite us while others leave us cold. Every human being operates under a set of basic drives, and the earliest framework to capture this came from Abraham Maslow's Hierarchy of Needs, 1943. He proposed that motivation arises in layers. We seek physiological needs first, food, water, safety, and only then move toward belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. Though modern research shows these needs often overlap rather than follow a strict order, the idea remains powerful. Our motivations evolve as our lives do. Beyond basic survival, our goals shape how desire expresses itself. Psychologists Edwin Locke and Gary Latham 1990 discovered that clear and challenging goals are among the strongest motivators. Their goal-setting theory found that when people define specific targets and believe those targets are achievable, performance improves dramatically. The mind craves clarity, it wants to know where to aim its energy. But clarity alone isn't enough. Motivation also depends on our belief that we can reach the goal. That's where Albert Bandura's concept of self-efficacy, 1977, comes in. Self-efficacy is the confidence in one's own capability to succeed at a task. When people believe they can influence outcomes, they persist longer, recover faster from setbacks, and interpret challenges as opportunities instead of threats. In contrast, low self-efficacy breeds hesitation and avoidance, not because the goal isn't worthwhile, but because it feels out of reach. Another psychological engine behind motivation is cognitive dissonance, introduced by Leon Festinger in 1957. This theory explains how we're driven to reduce internal tension when our actions and beliefs don't align. For instance, if someone values health but keeps skipping workouts, that conflict creates discomfort. To restore balance, the mind pushes for change, either by altering behavior or justifying it. This internal discomfort often becomes the spark that reignites motivation. And then there's the emotional side. Motivation doesn't live in logic alone, it thrives on emotion. Feelings act as signals of what's valuable to us. Positive emotions like curiosity, excitement, and pride tend to increase task initiation and persistence. Negative emotions, on the other hand, can either paralyze or redirect energy depending on how they're processed. A setback, if framed as feedback, can fuel determination, but if it's framed as failure, it can drain drive entirely. In short, the psychology of motivation isn't just about willpower, it's about the ongoing dialogue between our goals, beliefs, and emotions. Desire is the mind's way of translating what matters into movement. Motivation isn't static, it ebbs and flows like a biological rhythm. When we begin a new goal, there's often an initial surge of energy and excitement. This is sometimes called the novelty effect. The brain releases dopamine in response to new possibilities, giving us that sense of momentum at the start of a project or habit. But this burst is temporary. As novelty fades, so does the chemical reward that fueled our enthusiasm. This decline happens because of a process called habituation. The brain is designed to notice change, not constancy. When an activity or goal becomes familiar, the brain's dopamine response naturally weakens. Tasks that once felt exciting start to feel routine. It's not that we've become lazy, it's that our nervous system has normalized the experience. What was once a source of anticipation now feels predictable, and predictability doesn't excite the brain's reward system. This leads to what researchers call reward devaluation. Studies by Morton Kringelbach in the early 2000s showed that as a reward becomes familiar, its perceived value drops. It's the same reason why the first week of a new diet, exercise plan, or creative project feels powerful, but by week 5 or 6, motivation begins to slip. The reward hasn't disappeared, our brain just no longer interprets it as special. Expectancy and reward learning also play a key role in these fluctuations. Our motivation is tightly linked to what we expect from our efforts. If outcomes meet or exceed expectations, dopamine reinforces the behavior. But when progress feels slower than predicted, those reward signals fade. The result is a natural dip in drive. This is why people often feel discouraged midway through long-term goals, not because they're incapable, but because their brain's reward system is recalibrating. Research on long-term behavior change supports this pattern. For instance, Rothman 2000 found that participants in weight loss and health programs typically experience a steep decline in motivation around the 6 to 8 week mark. This drop-off isn't purely psychological, it reflects the fading novelty and the body's adaptation to new routines. So motivation changes over time because our brains are built to adapt. We chase the spark of the new, but as that spark fades, sustaining effort requires more than emotion. It requires structure, reflection, and a shift from excitement-driven energy to purpose-driven consistency. Motivation comes from two main sources: what's inside us and what's outside us. Psychologists call these intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and understanding how they interact explains why some goals feel deeply fulfilling, while others feel forced or temporary. Extrinsic motivation is driven by external rewards, money, praise, recognition, or social approval. These motivators can be powerful in the short term because they create clear, tangible incentives. For example, a bonus at work or public praise can spark a burst of effort. However, research shows that these boosts rarely last. Once the external reward is removed, the behavior often fades with it. This is known as the overjustification effect. demonstrated in Edward Desai's 1971 experiment, where participants who were paid to do a puzzle lost interest once the payment stopped. External rewards, when overused, can unintentionally weaken internal interest by shifting focus from enjoying the activity to earning the outcome. In contrast, intrinsic motivation comes from within: curiosity, mastery, enjoyment, and personal growth. It's what drives someone to practice an instrument, paint, or learn a language simply because it feels meaningful. Intrinsic motivation tends to produce more creativity, persistence, and satisfaction because it aligns with one's sense of identity and values. Yet, even this internal drive isn't limitless. Stress, fatigue, or prolonged uncertainty can erode it over time, especially when emotional or physical energy runs low. Human motivation rarely exists purely in one form or the other. Most goals involve a blend of both. For example, a student may begin studying for external reasons to earn a degree or make family proud, but over time they might internalize the process, finding personal enjoyment in learning itself. Psychologists call this the internalization process, when external motivators are gradually absorbed into a person's sense of self. This transformation is crucial for sustaining long-term goals, because once a task becomes self-relevant, it continues even without external pressure. Another powerful factor shaping both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is social comparison. According to Festinger's social comparison theory, 1954, we constantly measure our progress and value relative to others. This can work for or against us. Comparison can inspire ambition, but it can also create feelings of inadequacy that drain motivation. The key lies in directing comparison towards self-improvement rather than competition. Ultimately, sustainable motivation depends on alignment, when external rewards support rather than replace internal meaning. The most enduring drive comes not from what we get for our efforts, but from who we become through them. At the deepest level, motivation is personal. It's not only about goals or rewards, it's about who we believe we are and who we hope to become. Our sense of self acts as both a compass and a fuel source, shaping what feels worth striving for and what doesn't. When motivation fades, it often signals a mismatch between our actions and our identity. Research in identity psychology, such as the work of Daphne Oyserman 2009, shows that people are more motivated when their goals feel consistent with their self-concept. In other words, when a task fits who we think we are or who we want to be, it feels natural to invest effort. But when it feels disconnected from our sense of self, motivation quickly weakens. For instance, someone who sees themselves as a healthy person will find it easier to exercise regularly than someone who merely wants to try to work out. Identity gives effort meaning. This idea ties into E. Torrey Higgins's self-discrepancy theory, 1987, which describes the tension between our actual self, who we are now, and our ideal self, who we wish to be. That gap creates motivational pressure, a drive to move closer to our ideal. However, when the gap feels too wide or progress seems impossible, the same mechanism can turn painful, leading to frustration or avoidance. The key isn't to erase the discrepancy, but to make it manageable, setting goals that bridge the distance gradually rather than expecting instant transformation. Another dimension of self and motivation involves our personal narrative, the story we tell about our life. People tend to stay motivated when their goals align with their life story or sense of purpose. For example, someone who views their career as a way to help others is more resilient during setbacks than someone who sees it as just a job. This is because the first perspective connects effort to identity, and identity sustains motivation far longer than external pressure can. How we appraise setbacks also determines whether motivation survives challenges. According to cognitive appraisal theory, it's not the failure itself but the meaning we assign to it that matters. If a setback is seen as evidence of personal inadequacy, motivation collapses. But if it's viewed as feedback, information about what to adjust, the drive to continue often strengthens. The brain learns through interpretation as much as through action. Finally, sustaining motivation over time requires self-compassion. Research by Kristin Neff, 2003, shows that self-criticism may temporarily push performance, but it drains emotional energy in the long run. Self-compassion, on the other hand, fosters resilience. It allows people to face difficulty without collapsing into shame, which keeps the motivational system open and responsive instead of defensive. In the end, motivation and the self are inseparable. The more our goals express who we are and the kinder we are to ourselves along the way, the more consistent and sustainable our motivation becomes. While motivation begins in the mind, it's constantly shaped by the environment around us. Our surroundings, social connections, and cultural context can either nourish or drain our drive, sometimes without us realizing it. The truth is, motivation doesn't operate in isolation. It's a social and situational phenomenon as much as it is psychological. One of the strongest external forces is social reinforcement, the way approval, encouragement, and belonging sustain motivation. Humans are wired for connection, and the need for social acceptance activates many of the same brain circuits as physical rewards. When our efforts are acknowledged or mirrored by others, the brain releases dopamine and oxytocin, creating a sense of safety and satisfaction. This is why progress often accelerates when it's shared, whether through supportive communities, accountability partners, or mentors who validate our effort. Culture also plays a major role in how motivation develops. In individualistic cultures, motivation tends to center on personal achievement, autonomy, and self-expression. In contrast, collectivist cultures often emphasize duty, harmony, and contributing to the group. Neither is inherently stronger, they simply direct energy differently. Research suggests that people feel more sustained motivation when their cultural values align with the type of goals they pursue. A person raised to value cooperation, for example, may lose drive if pursuing purely individualistic rewards. The workplace offers a clear example of how environment shapes motivation. Studies by Desai, Olafson, and Ryan, 2017, show that three elements, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, predict long-term engagement. Autonomy gives people a sense of control, competence builds confidence through mastery, and relatedness connects effort to meaningful relationships. Work environments that neglect these needs tend to see motivation fade, no matter how many incentives they offer. Physical and contextual cues also influence how motivated we feel. Motivation is deeply context-dependent. Certain spaces, routines, or even times of day can strengthen or weaken our willingness to act. A cluttered or distracting environment, for example, subtly signals the brain that it's not time to focus. On the other hand, consistent cues like a designated workspace or ritual before starting a task can trigger automatic engagement. These small environmental structures reduce the need for willpower by turning effort into habit. Finally, motivation often spreads through social modeling, a concept rooted in Albert Bandura's social learning theory. Observing others succeed, especially those similar to ourselves, activates mirror neurons and increases our belief that we can succeed too. This vicarious motivation explains why witnessing effort, resilience, or creativity in others can reignite our own. The people we surround ourselves with subtly train our motivational system every day. In essence, environment and social context act as the stage on which motivation performs. The right surroundings don't replace internal drive, they sustain it, giving our intentions structure, meaning, and momentum. Even with the right goals, mindset, and environment, motivation naturally declines over time. This fading isn't a flaw in our character, it's a feature of how the brain manages energy and expectations. Understanding why motivation weakens helps us see it not as failure, but as part of a predictable cycle that can be navigated intelligently. One of the most common causes is cognitive fatigue. Sustained focus and self-control demand mental resources, and those resources are limited. Early research by Roy Baumeister introduced the concept of ego depletion, suggesting that willpower functions like a muscle that tires with use. While later studies refined this model, the basic truth remains. Constant effort without rest drains the brain's ability to maintain motivation. Attention, emotion, and decision-making all compete for the same mental fuel. Another factor is goal conflict. Humans rarely chase a single objective, we juggle competing desires, work versus rest, short-term pleasure versus long-term growth. When these goals clash, motivation fragments. The mind struggles to prioritize, leading to hesitation or procrastination. Research on self-regulation shows that divided goals don't just slow progress, they actually dilute emotional investment, making each task feel less meaningful. Lack of feedback also weakens drive. The brain needs evidence that effort is producing results. Without visible progress, the motivational system begins to shut down, as dopamine release depends heavily on reward feedback. This is why tracking small wins, even minor improvements, can sustain engagement. When feedback disappears, so does the signal that effort is worthwhile. Then there are unrealistic expectations. Motivation thrives on alignment between effort and outcome. When people expect rapid transformation or instant success, the inevitable delay between intention and results triggers disappointment. The brain interprets unmet expectations as prediction errors, the same mechanism that decreases dopamine. Over time, this mismatch erodes enthusiasm and confidence. Finally, persistent demotivation can evolve into learned helplessness, a concept introduced by Martin Seligman, 1972. When people experience repeated failure or perceive outcomes as uncontrollable, they stop trying even when success is possible. The brain essentially learns that effort doesn't matter, suppressing motivational circuits. This condition often appears in chronic stress, toxic environments, or situations where feedback is consistently negative or absent. In short, motivation fades for many reasons: depletion, conflict, uncertainty, or disappointment, but all stem from the same root: the brain's attempt to protect energy and minimize perceived loss. It's not that we stop caring, it's that the system momentarily shuts down to recalibrate. Recognizing this helps us respond with patience and strategy instead of self-blame. When motivation fades for too long, the effects aren't only practical, they're deeply emotional. People often describe this phase as feeling stuck, empty, or disconnected. What's happening beneath those feelings is a collapse in the sense of forward movement, a temporary disconnection between desire and action. Over time, this can lead to a state psychologists call demoralization, where a person still wants improvement but no longer believes they can achieve it. It's not depression in itself, but it shares many emotional features: apathy, low energy, and a loss of purpose. The emotional cost is amplified by shame and guilt loops. When motivation dips, people often criticize themselves harshly for being lazy or undisciplined. That self-judgment triggers stress, which further suppresses dopamine and executive function, making effort even harder. This creates a vicious cycle. Low motivation leads to guilt, guilt creates stress, and stress further diminishes motivation. Breaking this loop requires compassion and understanding rather than punishment. Another layer of difficulty comes from effective forecasting errors, the human tendency to mispredict how we'll feel in the future. We often imagine that once we start a goal, our motivation will stay strong, but emotional energy doesn't work that way. When our actual feelings don't match our expectations, discouragement sets in. The disappointment isn't just about progress, it's about the gap between how we thought we'd feel and how we actually do. Stress also plays a direct biological role in motivation loss. Chronic stress suppresses dopamine signaling in the mesolimbic system, reducing the brain's sensitivity to reward. This means that even activities that used to feel meaningful start to feel dull or effortful. Under long-term stress, the motivational system prioritizes short-term survival over long-term growth. The result is a kind of tunnel vision, a focus on immediate relief rather than progress. Over time, these emotional and physiological effects can lead to what some researchers describe as existential fatigue, a deeper form of burnout that isn't just about overwork, but about a loss of why. When purpose and direction erode, even rest doesn't feel restorative because the underlying sense of meaning has weakened. Psychologists studying burnout, such as Christina Maslach, note that recovery depends not only on reducing workload, but on reconnecting with meaning, rebuilding the link between effort and value. The emotional cost of losing motivation is heavy because motivation isn't just about doing, it's about feeling alive. When that spark dims, it touches every part of our psychological landscape. But understanding that these experiences are part of a natural, cyclical process, not a personal flaw, is the first step toward renewal.